Welcome. I want to start by thanking the Iowa Measurement Research Foundation, the Iowa Testing Programs, and the Educational Measurement and Statistics Department at the University of Iowa for their support, especially during this presidential year. My two favorite previous presidential addresses for NCME were Mike Colin's in 2000 about linking assessments effectively, and Greg Cizik's in 2013, an unpublishable presidential address, where he talked about his journey. And I'm going to mash them up a little bit. You're going to hear my version instead of Michael's. I was born into a family with an older sister, two first-generation parents. From the time I can remember, my mother was a junior high math teacher and my father was a secondary education professor. Both parents had advanced degrees. My mother had a master's plus 60 hours, and my father had a doctorate in education. My sister and I have both earned doctorates, she in reading, I in measurement. As a kid, dinner table conversations often revolved around education, which was a core value with our parents. My first research methods course was at Central Michigan University as an undergraduate. It was taught by my favorite professor of all time, my father. After I graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Elementary Education, I taught junior high math for a year in Hinesville, Georgia, then returned to Central to get my master's in elementary education. It was great. I was able to take 4 night classes each semester and do substitute teaching during the day. After earning my MA, I taught junior high math in Kenosha, Wisconsin. While I was there, I went up to look around the University of Madison campus, which was actually where my parents had met, in a math class. I stopped in at the placement office and asked, how was their placement of PhDs? Because if I was going to get a doctorate, I wanted to get a job after I did that. The gentleman I talked to was delightful, asked me what I was interested in, and called over to the Department of Educational Psychology and asked Mike Sokoviak if he could meet with me for a few minutes. Mike said yes, and after my conversation with him, I was sold on going to Madison. While I was at Madison, sorry, these are all going the wrong way. I was fortunate enough to take classes from Mike and from Ron Serlin and from Frank Baker. After graduation, I went to the University of Iowa Testing Programs as a postdoc and worked with Al Hieronymus and H.D. Hoover on the Iowa tests of basic skills. H.D. did 2 really great things for me. First, he gave me the advice, listen to Al. And as Michael said, I was in a workroom outside of Al's office, so I heard him talk to clients, to students, to coworkers, to teachers. When I left the postdoc, I had a large binder full of these scraps of paper with notes on them like, this is how Al talks to teachers. This is how Al describes reliability. This is how Al tells someone they're stupid politically correctly. It was a master class in practical issues related to operational testing. The second thing HD did for me is he introduced me to Bob Brennan. It was a social event. I know alcohol was involved, and to quote, "This is Deb, she needs a job." And Bob did go on to hire me, and I reported to Mike Colin for a number of years. Mike got me interested in equating, which was the basis for my whole career in comparable scores. Mike was a great person to learn operational equating under because he viewed it as a comprehensive process. He went deep into the details on samples, methodology, test development, test administration, and that really resonated with me. While I was working at ACT, I was walking downtown in Iowa City one weekend and I ran into Ann Cleary. And she said, would you be interested in teaching a course in measurement as an extension course in Des Moines? I said yes, and that started me on the path to becoming an adjunct at Iowa and being able to co-chair dissertations, teach other classes, and work with students. I was incredibly fortunate over the 33 years I was at ACT. I worked with some of the most gifted, compassionate, and scarily awesome psychometricians. We worked on some amazing projects that I continue to be proud of. The initial online testing with college reportable scores, the STEM and WorkKeys readiness scores on the ACT score report, launching ACT NextGen and ACT Aspire, state testing, licensure and certification work. I was originally interested in comparable scores in terms of equating, but my interest broadened to look at comparable scores under context effects, scrambled forms, concordances, test security, device and mode comparability, accommodations, item changes, translations, and it just kept expanding. When my position was eliminated at ACT, I was fortunate that the Iowa Testing Programs and the Iowa Measurement Research Foundation took me on as a visiting professor, where I've taught courses and worked with students on dissertations and other research projects. In addition, Steve Dunbar nominated me for EMIP editor, which I did for 3 years, and then I was approached to run for NCME president, and here we are. While I was at Iowa, my interest in comparable scores continued, and I want to talk about that a little bit this afternoon. Although most practitioners would agree that different scores should be comparable when we want to make consistent decisions on them, there's not a lot of guidance on what that means or what situations are more vulnerable to uncomparability. Being at Iowa allowed me to develop a seminar in 2018 called Score Comparability in Large-Scale Assessments. It was a wonderful opportunity, but I had a fantastic small group of students, and we looked at various aspects of comparability, including mode and device studies, translations, accommodations, administration conditions, etc. One of our first discussions was how to define what we mean by comparable scores. There are a variety of ways people have defined them, and there are a lot of different definitions, and I want to share a few examples with you that really resonated with me. Lord in 1950 said 2 scores may be comparable in the sense that each represents an equivalent amount of training, or that each promise an equivalent amount of future success in some specified activity. Winter in 2010 stated, in general, test scores can be considered comparable if they can be used interchangeable. The same interpretation should be able to be made with the same level of confidence from variations of the same test. How comparability is defined depends on the level of the score being used and how it is being used. In the context of device and timing studies, Wayne Camara stated, different stakeholders will often prioritize different claims for comparability. 2 such different claims are illustrated below. First, if a test taker took the assessment on another device or mode, he or she would have received the same score. And 2, the test taker took the assessment on the device most likely to produce the most accurate estimate of their true test score. Lyons and Marion in 2016 said comparability is a judgment based on the accumulation of evidence to support claims about the meaning of test scores and whether scores from 2 or more tests or assessment conditions can be used to support the same interpretations and uses. In this way, assessments are not dichotomously determined to be comparable or not, but like validity, comparability is a judgment about the strength of the theory and evidence to support the comparability of score interpretations for a given time and use. Lynn, in 1993, stated there's a desire to make comparisons from results on one assessment with those of another. The degree to which desired interpretations and inferences are justified, however, depends on the nature of the assessments being compared and the ways in which the linkage occurs. In a description of their online services, Responsive Translation defined different types of equivalence in a cross-cultural setting. Cultural equivalence means that concepts are effectively expressed across all versions of an assessment. Does the test employ the same modes of address? Does the assessment allow respondents to understand what is being asked of them in the way it was intended, even when an exact cultural equivalent may not exist? The goal of cultural equivalence is to ensure that cultural connotations are not gained or lost in translation. And finally, Marockley and Thompson in 2015 stated, the essence of score comparability we adopt is that for scores to be comparable, the validity of the interpretations of test scores should be similar. In our view, gathering evidence for score comparability follows a process similar to gathering validity evidence. The requirements for and sufficiency of evidence collected for purposes of evaluating score comparability are dictated by the particular interpretation and uses of test scores under consideration. So each of you probably has your own definition of test comparability, score comparability. Is it the same construct? Is it the same precision? Is it the same obtained reported score? Is it the same score distribution? Is it a matter of indifference to the examinee which score gets reported for them? There are many different definitions of what score comparability is. Equated scores seem to be universally accepted as a sort of gold standard for comparable scores. However, Newton in 2010 stated, the principal limitation of linking frameworks from the US tradition is equating envy. This limitation involves conceiving of every link as though it ought to somehow be created in the image of equating. The further a link departs from this image, the less good it is, to the point at which it ultimately becomes worthless. There's no doubt some truth in this characterization, but it is also unduly restrictive. So when we think about equating as being the gold standard of comparable scores, I think there's a few points we need to keep in mind. One of which is what we call equated scores don't necessarily meet the first or second order of equity or the conditions defined in Colin and Brennan about what equated scores characteristics they should have. Often we define it as equated scores whatever comes out of an equating process, and we don't look at the actual process, the properties of those scores. We just look at the fact that we ran an equating, this is the result, so therefore these are equated scores. We also typically deal with rounding, truncating, converting to score scales, which can complicate things. In addition, there isn't a true equated relationship between sets of scores, in the sense that if we had an equally appropriate but slightly different sample, we'd likely come out with a somewhat different relationship. If we used a different linking form, if we had a different linking path, if we used a somewhat different data collection design or a different smoothing value, we'd come up with a different result. We don't have a true equating result in practice. And often we have less than desirable, what we call equatings, when we have samples that are unrepresentative or too small or bad data collection, or there's rampant security issues which we're not aware of. This is not intended to be a rant against equating. I love equating. If I end up at a tattoo parlor, that's what I'm getting. But I'm less inclined to accept the results of when someone tells me as an equating without more information. Newton in 2010 stated, plenty of examples could be marshaled in which trying to approximate the logic of equating would be unfair, impractical, or just plain daft. Situations in which the best way to choose between approaches is not simply to slide down the continuum until you reach the strongest approach that works, but to think more strategically about the inferences that need to follow to enhance the potential for those scores for a particular use with legitimacy. There have been a number of frameworks around linking or comparable scores. Miss Levy in 92, Lin in 93, Wang and Colin in 01, Hollins and Durans in 06, Marockley and Thompson in 2015, Moses in 2022, Baldwin and Clauser in 2022, and Newton in 2010. Newton, talking about his framework, stated, this framework is concerned with definitions of comparability and not with methods for linking standards. This is where cunning comes into play, to work out how statistical or judgmental techniques can be employed to best approximate the logic of the underlying definition of comparability we wish to operationalize. So, where does that take us? Well, I think one thing we need to acknowledge is that no two administration events will ever be exactly identical. One student will sit closer to the light. One student will be next to somebody who coughs the entire session. In a timed test, students won't start the test at exactly the same instant. On a computer, one student will know how to optimize the computer for their testing experience, another student won't. We, as users of test scores, make judgments all the time on what is reasonable and what is not in terms of assuming comparable scores and treating those scores as interchangeable when making decisions. If I give a classroom test and I don't see evidence of cheating, I assume those scores are comparable, and I use them as such in assigning grades and other uses. So what does comparable scores really mean, and how do we relate it to the theme? I think we make better, more consistent, more fair decisions with comparable scores. I think we need to concentrate more on the decisions we want to make on scores. Otherwise, why give an assessment? Why collect a score if you're not going to make a decision based on that score? The decision might be you're likely to succeed in the next course, or I need to repeat the lesson on mixed fraction addition, or I think you're not likely to harm the public if we give you a license to practice. I want to make a decision, hopefully in conjunction with other information, which is why I give you the assessment and want your score. I want to be fair to those with stakes in the outcome of the decision, so the teacher of the next course doesn't get prepared students using one set of scores and unprepared students getting another set of scores. I want scores to be comparable for the decisions I want to make. So how do we evaluate comparability? That part's actually easy. Across equating studies, mode studies, device studies, linkages such as concordances, vertical scaling, international assessments, state assessments, there have been lots and lots of different methods used. So once we've run these analyses, then what? How much comparable is comparable enough for the decisions we want to make? We don't know. We don't even have a convention like a significance test in a 0.05 level. Comparability is a matter of degree. It seems somewhat elastic. What we really need are validity studies saying, based on the decision of these tests, are these decisions equally valid? And in the sense that they are, then these scores would be comparable. But that's way down the line from where we need to make the decisions, and it's very difficult to do those types of studies, and they're typically not done. Coe in 2007 stated, no statistical process, however sophisticated, can provide a full and satisfactory answer to the problem of evaluating the comparability of different assessments. There are too many different meanings of the word comparability, too many unknown but potentially important confounding factors, and too many different ways in which examinations are used. We must therefore seek to be clearer about our underlying conceptions of comparability and about the specific purposes to which we seek to put the examination results. One of the things we did in the seminar I had was try to rank order comparability. So assuming we have a college admissions test, which of these scores may be more or less comparable? And it was a very interesting discussion, and I'm sure if we had it here, we wouldn't all agree. But you can certainly have it at the reception if you want. So there's just not consensus on what's more comparable or less comparable. So what's the remedy if we decide the scores we want to make comparable aren't? Well, we could not treat them as if they are, which would seem obvious, or we could try to make them more comparable. We could do that through adjustments such as concordances or other linkages. We could try to make them more comparable through adjustments such as a standard setting. If this is the amount of knowledge you need to demonstrate on this assessment to go into the next course, let's set what we think is the equivalent amount of knowledge you need to show on this assessment to go into the next course. Or we could try to make the assessments that we're trying to make the scores off of comparable by changing the assessments. For example, if you want a paper assessment more equivalent with a computerized assessment, maybe you have to remove the technology-enhanced items. It's not a recommendation, it's just a statement of what do we value in comparability. Sometimes we just assume comparability. We looked at it once, we looked at mode effects once, we assume those still hold over time. We assume that embedded pretest items or position effects don't exist. And things change over time. So we might assume that we have a new printer of the test booklets, the paper's whiter. We assume that's not going to affect comparability of scores. But we have an upgrade to our scanner. It is detecting a finer level of graphite density, and we think, well, maybe that would affect the comparability of our scores. So we try to investigate that. Sometimes we use logic. A mistiming of 1 minute on an assessment, we say those scores are still comparable. A mistiming of 25 minutes, we say those scores aren't comparable. The administration manual says start testing at 8 o'clock. You start at 8:04, we let those scores go. You start at 8:42, we say those scores are void, you need to retest. Now, somewhere between those judgments, there should be a cut score that says up to here is valid for comparability, after this is not. But I've never seen any research that supports that, that says, you know, it's 7 minutes. Lower than 7 minutes, those scores are valid. Above 7 minutes, they're not. We don't do that research. Things change all the time. We want continuous improvement for our assessments. We want them to continually get better. But we need to think about these changes from a comparability standpoint, in my view. When many programs were going from paper to online, there were years of study. For others, COVID hit, they went overnight, and retroactively they're trying to look to see if those scores are comparable. Sometimes the changes are made voluntarily. We have a better way to assemble tests, so we're going to do that. Sometimes they happen without our desire. We built our test around this particular calculator. That calculator is no longer available. So we have to make a change, and we're not sure what's going to happen with comparability. There are a few contexts which I think we need to think more about in terms of comparability. One is in adaptive testing, automated test assembling, cloning, auto-generated items. I don't think we look at content at a fine enough level. Many of the CAT research studies assume that the item pool is unidimensional. It doesn't matter which items you get. Or we have very broad categories, like you need 3 geometry items, as if all geometry items were the same. I think we need to go deeper from a comparability standpoint on what are the actual characteristics of the items that we're cloning, that we're auto-generating, that we're putting in a CAT and saying these scores are comparable because the tests are comparable. I think we need more thought into accommodations from a comparability standpoint. When I was dealing with operational testings, I tried to get more information about what was the rationale for particular accommodations, and I was never able to find it. I could find no study that said for the particular test I was dealing with, time and a half was the appropriate accommodation based on research. I find it hard to believe that there was a lot of research done and time and a half, double time, and triple time were the only things that came out as being valid. It was never time and 3/4 or time and 1/4 or any other combination. Sometimes it gets thrown back, well, this is their accommodation in the classroom. But again, I know what the research is that says this is the appropriate accommodation. So from a comparability standpoint, I think we need more research on that. Policy issues are another thing that I think we don't look at with a deep enough comparability lens. Take the relatively simple topic of we administer a test, we report scores, then we find we have to score one of the items all correct. So does everyone get credit for that item? The examinees who admit it or don't reach that item, do they still get credit? Examinees who saw the item in a different form a week ago, a year ago, do they still get credit? From a comparability standpoint of scores, how do those decisions based on policy affect comparability? When we're training scoring engines, we want scoring engines to be equally appropriate across subgroups, but who provides the original responses to train the engine? Who scores the original responses? Are those subgroups represented? In some instances, some of those subgroups are quite small, so it may not be possible to get them in enough volume to actually affect the training of the engine. What does that do to score comparability once the engines are operational? When we have composite scores, or we use additional information in making a decision, do we assume that if the component scores are comparable, the composite scores automatically are? I don't think that's appropriate. If the score is one piece in a decision, do we look at if we substitute the concorded ACT score for the actual ACT score in the whole process, are we still making the same decision? Do we at least think about that from a score comparability way? When we use process data or plausible values, do we think about that from a comparability lens? If you have an unfinished cat and you use a plausible value as a score, is that comparable to someone who actually finishes the cat? And when we start using all this process data, is comparability still the same probability of getting the item correct, or is it the probability of getting the item correct in a particular time limit? There's just more and more information. We can dig deeper and deeper into comparability, and I think it can be totally overwhelming. Even if I'm just thinking of 4 students here taking a math test, 2 come with calculators, 1 uses a calculator, 1 doesn't. 2 don't bring calculators, but 1 wishes they had and 1's fine not. Are those scores comparable? In a sense that this is how they performed at this point in time on these particular items, maybe they are, but how often is that what we want to know? Usually we want to extrapolate from what we're seeing on the actual assessment to a bigger issue. And how do we determine if these scores are comparable or not? We have a lot of tools and methodology that can help us examine comparability and that can help us increase comparability. We use logic, we have experience. I think we need to pay more attention to data collection designs. I think one reason equating is almost revered is because there's a lot of attention paid to how we collect the data. That's often not the case in concordances and other types of linkages. Comparability relationships don't necessarily transfer either. If I have a relationship, for example, between the ACT and the SAT in English, that's not necessarily going to be the same relationship between the Braille tests or between tests translated into Spanish. I think comparability is context specific. ACT, SAT have concordance tables with a lot of caveats. They're different assessments, they measure different things, they have very different score scales, they define the criterion of college readiness different, yet they both seem to be usable in certain college admissions decisions quite effectively. But when we go into the state testing realm, when we're using ACT scores or SAT scores to look at the achievement of state objectives, I don't think a concorded SAT score is equivalent to an actual SAT score and to which state standards you're meeting. So I think we need to think more broadly about what comparable scores and comparable decisions are. To quote Bennett in 2018, "I expect tests of the future to be in some sense personalized. The reasoning here is simple. Students come to education and to assessment with different levels and types of competency, diverse backgrounds, and varied interests. Our characterizations of what students know and can do might be improved if we could somehow better accommodate diversity." Durans and Haberman in 2022, "Individualized assessment for learning is an attractive idea. Part of its appeal lies in the sensible notion of providing appropriate accommodations that depend on the purpose of the assessment. If we want to assess someone's reading comprehensive skills, we should test them in their native language and allow them to wear corrective lenses if they are needed. Eyeglasses are a needed accommodation that generalizes across languages. It doesn't alter the construct. The choice of language is a different matter. I believe the context of assessment matters for assessment items. Back when I was an elementary math teacher, 2 inches plus 3 inches was an easier item than 2 centimeters plus 3 centimeters because centimeters was not a familiar term for the students. And even though the addition was the same, the context made the item more difficult. So I do believe we need to pay attention to assessment item context. I don't believe context-free items are necessarily problematic. I think 2 plus 3 or spell Illinois are legitimate items. And whether you agree or disagree with that, I think we would all agree that context-free items are not measuring what we mostly want to measure. They're not measuring applications. If you have a math problem, a story problem, it needs to be in a context. If you want to measure reading comprehension, it needs to be in a context. We do deal with individualizing assessment to some degree already, and we've done it somewhat successfully, I think, with translations, transadaptations, accommodations in PISA and TIMSS and other assessments. But we tend to view the groups that we're accommodating for as homogeneous groups. My understanding is in PISA, if your country's primarily language is Dutch, every student in that country gets the same assessment in Dutch. In the US, everyone gets the same assessment in English. So we're treating the subgroups as completely homogeneous, and I don't think we can do that anymore. But then the problem is, what subgroup is the most salient for any individual? I mean, we all have racial groups, we all have gender groups, we all have economic groups, we have geographic groups, etc. How do I know for this particular test examinee which subgroup I should contextualize the text around to optimize for that person? And then how do we figure out what is comparable across all those different subgroup combinations to know what's the best way to assess the person? Well, I think one thing we need to do is go back to Wayne's second definition. The test taker took the assessment most likely to produce the most accurate estimate of their true test score for the decision we want to make. I think we need to get away from focusing on the comparability of the assessment and focus on the comparability of the decision. Newton in 2010 stated exactly what linking relationships is appropriate in which situation will depend not simply on the context of use, but also and more importantly upon the reason for linking. The reason for linking clarifies the inference that needs to follow from score linkage. It clarifies what the link ought to mean. Importantly, this meaning may be at least somewhat distinct from the constructs examined by either of the to-be-linked assessments. Linking is not necessarily about expressing a score from one test or examination in terms of the scale of another. It may be about finding an entirely different sense in terms of which the scores of both assessments can be expressed and understood. Scores that at face value mean different things can still share meaning. So to conclude, comparability is not a property of assessment scores. It's of the use, the context, the sample, and the decision, like validity or reliability. And we can make better decisions with comparable scores than without them. And when we think comprehensively about comparability, I think we can leverage measurement in all its glory to make those better decisions. So my plea to you is to think broadly about what comparable scores mean, especially as we start thinking about how to better address equity and fairness. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the honor to be your NCME president and for all the support during my term. I'll be handing the title over to Michael as of 6:10 p.m. tomorrow. Please show him the support that you've shown me. But it's my pleasure now to end this meeting, to crown Michael. And to invite you all to the President's Reception in Salon 1 and 2 on the 7th floor at 6:30. Thank you very, very much.